So what Liam's asked me to talk to you a little bit about is talking about establishing themes and deciding on the story of your temporary exhibition. I suppose just to give you a little bit of background as to what I do and I suppose where I'm coming from. I'm the curator of the Pearse Museum. So this is the Pearse Museum. It's all very lovely. It's in a park in Rathfarnham, in the south suburbs of Dublin, in Rathfarnham. It's the former home of Patrick Pearse, the leader of the 1916 Rising, and it's also where he ran his school from about 1910 to 1916. It came into state care, signed over to the state in about 1968, and then opened as a museum in 1979. And then in 2008 we reopened after a major refurbishment. And as Pat was saying, maybe we shouldn't be referring to permanent exhibitions, but the bit I don't have to change every year is largely at the moment made up of an attempt to recreate or represent the house in a way that would suggest how it might have been in Pearse's time, or certainly to give you a sense of the original use of the rooms. This is the entrance hall of the museum, and I suppose what we try to do with the house is to use the house to tell at least some of the story. And as a result, the interpretation is at quite a low level. Well, that was the hope anyway. There was at a quite low level, so that when you went in, you still felt that this was kind of a real, breathing, living house, and not somewhere that had been museumified. So, as I said, the interpretation is done through these kind of, mostly in the main house, done through these kind of small individual panels, which are based on original historical quotes relating to people who were in the house in the time of Pearse and after. And my idea, when we were coming up with this idea, with this kind of plan for the interpretation of the house, was I was reading all these really interesting articles about the house and Pearse and this story, and I kind of wanted to get that kind of excitement that you had that when you were reading this thing and you're going, oh my god, that happened in this room, or this is what it was like to have been in this room 100 years ago. So in the hallway, for example, we have a quote here from Pádraig Óg, who was one of the pupils in the school, who was actually from Rossmuck in Connemara, where Pearse had his holiday home. And this is his kind of description of coming into this space for the first time. Actually, it's actually described in the first school, but he talked about coming into the entrance hall and seeing these two paintings here, both by Beatrice Ellery, and the effect that had on him, and how overwhelmed he was, and about meeting the Pearse family for the first time. Then the other thing that we have there is a quote from Patrick Pearse's sister, Margaret, and it's her account of saying goodbye to her brothers in that hall. One of the problems we have in the Pearse Museum is people come because obviously they're interested in Pearse and the 1916 Rising, and that all happened, a few miles away in the centre of Dublin, and they come out to the Pearse Museum and they find squirrels and they find trees and they find flowers and they find this beautiful house and they find no guns and they find no destruction and they find, it's all very kind of bucolic and lovely. So rather than trying to impose that story in some ways where it doesn't belong in the main house, what we thought was, well, we'll look at these other side stories to this big historic event. So this is Margaret Pearse talking about, as I said, saying goodbye. It's a very ordinary quote, but it's all the more profound for that, where she says, after tea and a little talk, they both arranged to leave us again. That's Patrick and William Pearse. As they were passing through the front hall, Pat suddenly turned back and went down the stairs again. Mother said, "Did you forget something?" He said, "I did." He came back, and either Mother or I asked him, "Did you get it?" I do not know what it was he had forgotten. His answer was, "I did." Those were the last words I ever heard him speak. So the idea is that when you're in that space, like, this is what you're imagining, and this is I suppose the experience that you're having in that space. So as I suppose you hope that these kind of things work, but it was only actually when I was on the train down here I was thinking in terms of temporary exhibitions. Initially I was thinking of creating an exhibition and bringing stuff into a space, but a temporary exhibition could be going to a historic place and then just opening it to the public. I'm the chair of the Irish Museums Association, and every year we have about 6 different visits to different historic museums, usually around Dublin actually, because we can't get enough people when we travel out. But on Saturday we went to the tenement museum in the Ivy Trust buildings. It's a small little flat it was occupied from about 1913 up until the beginning of this century by the same woman, and initially by her family, then her and her own. And she didn't really change anything. And occasionally now they open it up. And that's all they do. They just open it up and they come in and they tell people the story of this house. And they don't do any fancy interpretation or have any interactives or anything like that. And it works perfectly. So, when we're thinking about temporary exhibitions, maybe that's I don't want to say all you need to do, because actually that can be a very complicated idea. But sometimes, like I said, just letting people be in a space and offering them, some information about what might have happened there before without interfering with it at all is all you need to do. I was in Romania recently, and I went to the military barracks where the Ceausescus were executed, and what was so wonderful about it was the fact that they haven't changed anything really. They've done some really bad interpretation outside, and I'll be looking at that later, but inside the building they haven't done anything. So you walk in and it looks exactly like it does when you watch the clips on YouTube of the trial back in 1989. So as I said, sometimes it takes a lot of courage just to do nothing. So I said, this is Pearse's study. This is again our kind of reimagining based on photographs, but also kind of including stuff that will allow guides who do guided tours to talk about different aspects of Pearse's life. So, in there you can see there's a magic lantern slide machine, so you can talk about Pearse in terms of his love of new technology. People are fascinated by the fact that he had a telephone. But also, we have reproductions then of his writings and stuff like that. So it's all about, as well, about giving the people who are involved in your exhibition, particularly if you're involving people to do guided tours, something to talk about. So I said, this is a quote from a guy called Joe Sweeney about his first time meeting Pearse. But we also have more conventional exhibitions, stuff in cases and information on the walls. This is a room devoted to the sculptural work of William Pearse, and it's kind of deliberately done in a very old-fashioned way. So these cases are from the National Museum of Ireland, and kind of did it that way just in some ways so that you didn't have a jarring effect of going from a historic building into another room. But also, it's I suppose making reference to maybe how these objects might have been originally exhibited at the turn of the century. But this is our new fancy reception. Look how we cleared out all the people, as Pat was saying. Yeah, especially when the architects want the photograph taken, they hate to have the people in there. They're all so messy. But you can see there we have interpretation as well. But one of the big things that we did was put a big emphasis on when we reopened was the idea of having a temporary exhibition space, because one of the problems with the Pearse Museum in terms of trying to attract people there is to a certain extent we're a one-trick pony. So you're trying to get maybe publicity for what you're doing, and you ring up a journalist and they'll say, "So you're still doing that Pearse thing?" Yeah, he still led the Rising, yeah. Nothing, no big developments there, no, still, yeah, died, tragic, nationalism, poems, plays, yeah, still the same. And even, even with the local community, who are really important to us, because we're actually a tricky place to get for tourists, and we're not on the tourist trail, so we rely a lot on locals. You need to offer them something new and something different, and also something that maybe can kind of challenge what people maybe expect to find in the Pearse Museum. And also you need to get new audiences, because there are a lot of people, and history isn't their thing, and that's fine. So sometimes you say, well, is there anything else that maybe we could do that would still be appropriate to the building that we're in, but which might engage a little bit more? So we've tried to do about maybe 3 to 4 temporary exhibitions a year, depending on how energetic I'm feeling or how busy we are. So this is one of our earliest ones. This was a touring exhibition from the National Gallery called Revelation. It was an exhibition of prints, and Pearse was very into the idea of art as an important, a crucial part of education, that art was something that would inspire pupils and free their imagination. And I thought this print exhibition was very appropriate because as well it involved craft. Pearse's father was a stone carver, his brother was involved in the Irish art scene at the time, which was very much centred not just around art but also around craft, and they had connections with Dunedin and the Coola Press and things like that. This was St. Colmcille's community school. They were celebrating their 10th anniversary. Coincidentally, the same year we were celebrating a centenary of Pearse moving out to Rathfarnham. And this was great because it gets a new audience in. So for a few weeks we had lots and lots of teenagers coming in to see their art because it was their colleagues or their own art, and then they were bringing in their family and their parents. So this was an exhibition that we hosted in 2011 by a woman called Lisa Young, who kind of approached me, and she had an exhibition she wanted to do which was based on the experience of, inspired by the experience of female nurses in the First World War. And you can see all that kind of broken ceramics, and she was kind of interested in ceramics as maybe representative of maybe the feminine experience. And what she did was she got these lots of kind of historic pieces of ceramic. Some of them she broke, some of them she did kind of various kind of treatments on to alter them in some way, and then repaired them, but improperly, or not exactly. And this was this kind of metaphor for these women's lives, that they had somehow put themselves back together, but everything didn't quite fit again. So this was really interesting. First of all, it allowed us to talk about the First World War in the Pearse Museum, which could be problematic. Again, it attracted a different audience. And as Pat was saying, with temporary exhibitions you can take a bit of a risk. So, a lot of people don't like art exhibitions. A lot of people really don't like it from our surveys. A lot of people really like art exhibitions at the Pearse Museum. Some people really don't like them at all. And sometimes they will, you'll get emails complaining, and you can say, that's terrible. I'm really sorry that you didn't have a nice time in the museum or you didn't enjoy your exhibition. But it's going to be gone in a month. So, by the time people can get really, really angry, say, oh yeah, that's gone now. So we're moving on. But we do historical exhibitions as well. So this was kind of the most elaborate one we did for. We did this in 2010 to celebrate the centenary of Pearse moving to Rathfarnham, and we actually reused an old exhibition quite a lot in this. I'm all for recycling exhibitions. Not just, as Pat said, it's not about kind of going somewhere else and saying that's a grand exhibition, we just stick with it as is. You must kind of adapt and think how will they work in your space. But as I said, sometimes exhibitions are very short life, and it can be useful to kind of reimagine them again. And this is another example of a recycled exhibition. Pat first did this exhibition in Kilmainham in 2001, back near the beginning of the century. And we did it again in the Pearse Museum in 2011. Looked at it had been kind of designed for Kilmainham Jail, so we added material from our own collection and from the collection in Derrynane, and basically it was just taking a few objects which had an amazing story to tell, put them in a case, and write a slightly longer than usual label explaining why these objects were significant. So again, it's a very, very simple idea, but simple ideas are great, but to do them right can take a lot of work. This is kind of, in some ways, kind of a similar idea, the idea of kind of limiting the amount of objects that you use in an exhibition. This was one we did this year at the inspiration of Heritage Council. This year asked people to look at maybe doing exhibitions based on maybe 10 objects. So this was telling Pearse's story in just 10 objects. And again, it worked really well because to a certain extent, when you have lots of stuff on display, the significance of particular objects can get lost into a kind of a wider narrative. And it was really, really interesting just to concentrate on 10 particular objects. And this is the one that we have at the moment, which is looking at Pearse in 1913. He wrote a series of articles in 1913 called From a Hermitage. And we decided we'd particularly concentrate in two of the rooms on a reference he makes to a slum collapse and living conditions in slums in Dublin in 1913. And we incorporated into this kind of overall exhibition about Pearse a big section based on some photographs taken of slum conditions in Dublin in 1913. Again, photographic exhibitions, really popular and quite straightforward. So So, getting started. I think first of all, I think you should start off by saying, well, why do we want to mount an exhibition? I think, sometimes people can automatically, oh, well, we have to do an exhibition. I think it's always really important to decide from the very beginning, why do we want to do this? What is the story that we have to tell? It's no point in starting off saying we want to have an exhibition because we want to have an exhibition. I think you're kind of putting the cart before the horse there. And also I think it's worth thinking, is an exhibition the best way to tell your story? Have you considered other options? Have you considered a film, a publication, or a website? Are you doing something that might be more appropriate to one of these different methodologies? Because I have gone to exhibitions that were in fact publications placed on a wall, not good. And I said, the website, I said maybe it's more appropriate to a website, but I think we also need to start thinking of exhibitions on websites as temporary exhibitions in themselves, and not as an add-on to an exhibition, or not as something different, but maybe an involvement of the exhibition idea. I think you should always start with the story. This is a picture from our own collection. This is The Man Buried Raftery by Jack B. Yates. This was actually owned by Pearse. But I think it's a really kind of useful image to have in a museum. The idea of telling a story, and as Pat was saying earlier, maybe even like a return to that kind of tradition of storytelling, and that according to fake Irish pubs, Irish people are really good at storytelling. So maybe we should kind of return to that. But just to start very much with the basics, and a quote from Mark O'Neill, who is actually originally from Cork. He wrote, "Museums which seek to face up to the complexity of both visitors and contents are shifting from a communication strategy based on detached aesthetics and information transfer to one based on storytelling. The human mind makes sense of the world by telling stories. Everyone is engaged in a constant process of telling and retelling their own story as they try to assimilate new experiences to previous versions of who they are and how the world works. At a cultural level, this capacity for meaning-making through narrative is what underlies the great myths and fairy tales and the great majority of art forms." So, at the centre of everything is this idea of a story, of something that will engage. So you want to be like that old Chanakey in the corner who has those children slightly frightened, but also fascinated. So when you start deciding on your theme, as I said, start with something that's going to be engaging for a target audience. So you might have a story that's really interesting to you, but is anybody else going to be interested? Catherine Tate, the comedian, she had a character called, what's her name? Lorraine. And her catchphrase was, "I'm above it." So she was this awful teenager, and no matter what her teachers or anybody else said to her, she just went, "I'm above it." And sometimes I think we should imagine our audience a little bit like a slightly taciturn teenager. And because museums can turn you into a taciturn teenager. I turn into a taciturn teenager sometimes in boring exhibitions where I go, "Oh, there's more, and yet there's more, and I don't care anymore." And even with the best stories, I was on my holidays, I was in Florence for the first time, and I was in the Uffizi, and they've got the best, some of the best art in the world, and it was just more of it, and more of it, and more of it, and so and some of this, like this is art that I've been looking at for years in books and thinking, this is wonderful, and it is wonderful, but I've just been there quite a long time, and I was going, that's beautiful, that Caravaggio, I'd really like a cup of coffee though. I don't want to see a Caravaggio, I just want a cup of coffee. So even with the best story, you need to constantly be thinking about, how am I engaging my audience? I said exhibition should be focused but not narrow. So it can be very easy sometimes if you pick a theme. So you're saying we're telling the history of the town, and one person runs in one direction and the other person runs in the other direction, and somebody else runs in the straight ahead. So you have all this kind of, it's a huge unquantifiable mass, and having an eclectic approach can be really useful, but also it needs to all kind of coalesce into something that is meaningful, so that people kind of don't go in kind of, well, we started off and we looked at the local industry, and then there was a little bit about the church, and then there was a little about this, and something, you just kind of get lost in this morass. And the other thing, I think, when you're thinking of an exhibition theme is, is this something that you're able to represent in an exhibition? You know, there are some subject matters which resist that kind of storytelling. And I said, in some ways, I'm returning back to that idea. Is this a story that would be better as a radio documentary? Is this something that would be better, as I said, in publication form? You know, are there images and objects that will illustrate this, or are you going to end up having to talk and describe everything to your visitors? So, I said, not everything is. Audiences, I suppose, this is the key. Audiences are mixed, and in museums we try to box them up. I think that's because there's a tradition in museums into kind of categorizing and identifying, and I'm always a little bit wary by saying, well, this is what families want, and this is what individuals want, because people resist these categorizations. But I suppose it's just important, maybe sometimes, to think that these are the diverse kind of people that you may be trying to attract. So you've got individual adults, children, students, families, retired people. You have a local audience, a national audience. You've got tourists. You've got specialists. You may have an exhibition that you want to attract, a particular group. You might do an exhibition purely aimed at school children, or purely aimed at, you could do an exhibition that's purely aimed at under 5, with no words, and lots of, and there are museums for children of all kinds of different ages. So if you're doing that, that's great. But I suppose what most people, when you say, these are the different categories, which ones are you aiming your exhibition? Usually the reply is, I suppose, all of them. Certainly, I suppose, in our case as well, to a certain extent, we're trying to have something that will attract everybody, because it's a kind of competitive market out there, and you can't really be dismissing anybody. The other thing I think when you're starting off in an exhibition is to define what you want to achieve. Like, as I said, why do you want to do an exhibition? Are you trying to raise awareness of a particular thing? Are you trying to deepen people's understanding? Increasing audiences. Again, as I said, that sometimes you may have a space that has, been offering one story for a long time, and you're seeing, well, are there other people who might be interested in what we have to offer? The other thing I thought about was just enriching the life of the community. There may be an argument to have an exhibition which is just for the community itself. And I suppose, getting back to something that Pat was saying, sometimes in terms of attracting people outside the community, they can be the most successful because there's an authenticity to a community talking about itself to itself. And a few years ago we were at the Irish Museum Association conference. We had a representative from Falch Ireland, and they were saying, people in the audience were saying, we can't get any funding for people in local authority museums, saying, we can't get any funding from you because you don't consider us part of the tourism product. And they said, but if you look at what tourists are looking for in Ireland, one of the highest things they're looking for is authenticity. They want something real. They don't want something packaged for tourists. Particularly in Ireland, where you have to be a little bit more adventurous to come to Ireland, because it's not that easy to get around, particularly if you get outside of Dublin. So these tend to be adventurous people. And the analogy I always use is, when you go abroad, you don't go, oh great, the tourist menu, I bet you that's good. Tourists kind of resist stuff that we try and force upon them, because often it's pre-prepared and ill-prepared. And as I said, if you wanted bad Italian food, I could have stayed in Dublin and got that. Again, saying that as well, I realise that a big, particularly at the moment, there's a big pressure on people involved in heritage and the arts to boost tourism. But as I said, don't be afraid to make that argument about if people come back and say, this isn't an exhibition aimed at tourists. This seems to be aimed at yourself. If you aim at a tourist, they may resist. And as I said, people are getting, all the time, they're getting more and more sophisticated. Again, to come back to the Irish pub analogy, why would you come to a fake Irish pub in Ireland when you could go to a fake Irish pub in Middlesbrough? You know, where you could get exactly the same product. People want something that's real. And the other thing, I suppose, is to look at temporary exhibitions as a way of revitalising a public space, as a way to, I suppose, reimagine a public space. And again, this is why I think this idea of a pop-up exhibition is really useful and really important, and can be a way, even just for a very short period of time, to open possibilities in a space. And because it's temporary, you're not saying we're going to have an exhibition here forever, but maybe this is a way that we can, you know, revive or reimagine how this space could work and give us new ideas. And as I said, don't be, as Pat was saying, don't be afraid to experiment a little bit in what you're doing. So as I said, first of all, when you're starting your temporary exhibition, assess your assets. Your assets can include knowledge, and that's probably one of the big things that you have going for you. Nobody will know your place like you know your place. And particularly if you're living in an area, there's a knowledge that comes from that you can't learn by going on Google. You may have a collection, you may not. As I said, I suppose because I'm coming from a museum background, that's where we often start. But you know, collections don't have to necessarily come with a museum number. Collections can be stuff that people have within the community themselves. Collections may be stuff that you can buy in the shop. A few years ago, one of my first proper jobs in a museum, I was working in England around the time of the millennium. And to celebrate the millennium, I said I was based in Newcastle in the northeast of England. We asked people to donate 5 objects to represent their lives from a kind of a variety of people of different ages, different backgrounds. And just said, just go and just give us 5 things that represent you. And the stuff that people came up with was absolutely fascinating, really, really interesting material. But often we found as well that, you know, the things that were important to people, you know, we had students who were saying, well, this is my favourite album, this is the music that means something to me in the year 2000, but obviously they weren't going to donate it to us. So we went to the shop and we bought stuff, and you know, that's how we collected. We just went in, saw what people are using. The other asset, and this is, I suppose, this is key, it's dull and inevitable, is budget. Is just to think about how much money you have, and say, okay, well, this is how much we have. And again, often exhibitions can cost as much or as little as you want. And I don't know if we learned much from the Celtic Tiger, but one of the things I think we learned in museums was money isn't always the answer. And actually too much money can make really bad exhibitions. The other thing is that in terms of budget, sometimes there's fixed things that you will have, fixed hardware that you may or may not have. And again, this is something that's worth thinking about. You know, you may have lighting, you may not. You may have exhibitions, you may not. You may have stands or all kinds of other things. And if you're looking at maybe a program of temporary exhibitions, sometimes it's worth the investment in saying, okay, we're going to buy maybe 3 or 4 exhibition cases, and we can use these in a variety of different ways. So I would advise you to get something that is kind of non-specific, that is adaptable. But as I said, you know, you might be able to find these. You may be able to borrow these as well. So you know, talk to your local museum, your local library. Talk to your local shop fitter, local shops as well. I went when I worked at Newcastle. I remember there was a voluntary museum, and they had the most amazing exhibition cases I'd ever seen. They were every time one of the big department stores in Newcastle were having a refurbishment, they used to go to them, and they had these beautiful kind of mahogany glass cases with huge plate glass, stuff you could never be able to afford normally if you're a voluntary museum. They also used to get their mannequins from the shop, which was less successful because they were a maritime museum, and most of the mannequins were female mannequins, and there was they were really those really 70s ones with the kind of the hands that went like this, and painted on makeup and then a painted on beard. So it was great. It was like this kind of drag maritime history of Newcastle. But I have to say, I've been to a lot of really boring maritime museums. I don't remember any of the mannequins except for that museum. So, you know, the quirky can be good and stuff. You know, and there was there was a sincerity to that exhibition that sometimes you didn't get at more kind of slick, more expensive exhibitions. Your venue, again, that's a major asset and a key part of the type of exhibition that you're going to be able to put on. And again, one of your big assets are your local networks. So if you are assessing what do we have, maybe the most important thing you have is the knowledge, not just of yourselves, but of the people and the community around you. So this is the one bit where I'm going to get a bit technical and insistent. I've described this as make yourself and your audience a map. I think it's really important if you're doing a temporary exhibition, particularly if it's one where you're very much trying to tell a story, is to make a map, or I would generally call it kind of an exhibition or interpretive plan. So it's not very complicated. And when Liam asked me to do this, I went, I don't know if it's temporary exhibition. I don't know if I have much to say for a whole hour, because sometimes it's very straightforward. So don't be kind of put off by kind of the idea of sitting down and drawing up a plan. But what I would suggest is you draw up a plan, say this is our main theme, and define it within maybe 2 sentences. I had a theory once that if you couldn't say what your exhibition was in 1 sentence, maybe you needed to think a little bit again about what your theme was. I remember being involved in an exhibition once, and it was a paragraph rather than a sentence summed it up, and that was a slight problem. Because I said, well, it's about this, and it's also about this, and it's also about this as well. So I think if you want a really focused exhibition, be able to sum it up maybe in 1 sentence. So in your interpretive plan, have just a very short overall description. I said no longer than a paragraph. The overall tone of the exhibition. How do you want people to feel? Is this going to be kind of a warm, embracing kind of exhibition? Is it like a really, really kind of stark subject matter? And Irish heritage involves a lot of really sad and disturbing things, and a warm tone isn't going to be possible there. And then I think you should, if you have your main theme, then you should be breaking it down into kind of sub-themes as well, or subsections. And then in those subsections, again, describe, well, that's our main theme, this is our sub-theme, and they should kind of relate. Again, you can kind of vary the tone a little bit as well. So maybe you have an overall tone for how this exhibition should feel. So is this an exhibition that should feel like a community effort, as Pat was talking about, that kind of serendipity of an awful lot of objects together? If you're doing maybe a stark story, if you're looking at something like the famine, maybe an exhibition which is very stark, which includes very few material objects, maybe that might be something which would be more effective. And I said within that you can look at kind of varying the story a little bit along the way. And what I do when I'm writing these plans is if I say, okay, this is my sub-theme, start kind of assembling images, objects, other things that you're going to use to tell that story. Doesn't mean you're necessarily going to use them in the final exhibition, but just from the beginning to be able to say, okay, we have this theme, and what's the kind of things that we're going to use to tell this story? I said I'm conscious of the fact that I'm coming from this like conventional museum thing, talking about objects and images and whatever. There could be all kinds of different ways that you're going to try and represent these stories. And then this is crucial. You can see here, this was the lovely plan that I got from the architects, and then this is me imposing myself on space. But it's really important as well that you think about the space in which the exhibition is going to go, and that you plan your exhibition around there. So there's no point in you saying, okay, I'm going to do the history of the town, and we're going to have one bit here about working life, and we're going to have one here about recreation, and we're going to have another section over here which will be about education in the town, when you've only got like one room. So think about the space in which you're going to operate in, and often the exhibition spaces that you get to work in are not necessarily going to be amenable to what to the way you want to tell the story. So you need to work with the space, not against it. This is the first floor of the Pearse Museum, which is relatively straightforward. I'm kind of struggling at the moment with the place we're hoping to do a permanent exhibition on Pearse's life is in the basement, which is a series of rooms, tiny rooms leading to other tiny rooms. and trying to keep a story that will work in that kind of space is really challenging. I'm also struggling to move that exhibition we did on Pearse and 10 Objects. I think we put it downstairs for a little while, so kind of also struggling with an exhibition that wasn't designed for that space and trying to kind of shoehorn that in. And it's much more straightforward if from the very beginning you're starting with that space in your mind and almost visualizing how you think the exhibition is going to look. So at a certain point, I remember Pat saying this about the exhibition in Kilmainham, you know, he could imagine how the exhibition was in that space, and it's something I've tried to do as well, you know, even before anything goes in, say, okay, this is how I think this is going to look, and always have the space in your mind when you're planning your exhibition. Then in terms of how you tell the story, chronology is good. There's a lot to be said about chronology, because that's kind of how we understand the world sometimes, and that's how we understand history. There's Alan Bennett's wrote a really interesting book, play about called The History Boys, which is set in this kind of sixth form, where there's all these kind of unbelievably bright young boys going for the Oxford and Cambridge exams. And there's one guy who's it's set in Yorkshire, and there's one guy who's like a fairly stereotypical gruff Yorkshire, and he goes for his, he's in the class one day and all the other boys are being incredibly erudite about history, and he never says much, but eventually they said, well, like, what do you think? And he said, well, history, it's one effing thing after another. So that's the chronological approach. Right? History, one effing thing after another. But sometimes chronology isn't going to work for the story that you want to tell. Sometimes it's not even desirable. And again, in terms of trying to mix things up a little bit, it can be useful to think in other ways. So maybe think thematic. So instead of telling the history of the story of the town from A to Z, from the year dot to today, take different themes. So look at, you know, how do people work at different points in the history of this town? How do people enjoy themselves at different periods in this town? And even draw connections. So I think it's really interesting to draw connections between how do people socialise in this generation, you know, going to kind of nightclubs and bars, dance halls in the 50s, you know, K-leaves and that kind of thing in the more distant part, and maybe to put them together and to draw these connections between each other, and not necessarily, as I said, just look at it chronologically. Modular is also useful as well if you have a tricky space, and that's something I'm looking with my difficult basement in the Pearse Museum, is to have an exhibition where within each space there's a story that people can comprehend, and at the end, hopefully, that these different stories that they've gone to, maybe not in an order that, you know, that you want people to go in, where you can't direct people to say, you go to space A, B, C, D, and E, that they're able to understand the story through, I suppose, the combination of these different themes. Then deciding on your media, how you're going to tell the story, how you're going to communicate. I suppose the classic one are text panels and labels. It's the one we mostly do because they tend to be the cheapest. Interactives, both digital but also physical. You know, I was at a meeting once and someone said, well, what about interactives? And one of the things we're having is having exhibition cases with drawers. I said, well, actually that is an interactive, you know, because the person is kind of interacting with the space they're being allowed to discover on their own. So it doesn't have to necessarily involve a computer. Website, again, and looking at the website not as maybe something just to publicise the exhibition, but also something that could be part of the exhibition. And like things like Facebook are really useful in terms of allowing people to kind of respond. Collections, replicas, models, apps, handouts, trails. As Pat said, one of the most useful things that maybe, particularly if you're coming from a community background, you can offer are people from the area who are willing to show people around. Because sometimes what people are coming to a museum or an exhibition is actually just to meet people from the area. And that could be the thing that they're looking for. Again, images, objects. Images, I think, are really useful in terms of temporary exhibition. But I would limit the number of images sometimes. sometimes it's really, if you have a really powerful image, it's going to say more than something that a whole kind of plethora of very, very small images. So sometimes you're better off just going with one, but again, it depends on the exhibition. Then finally, as I said, in terms of what you include, some objects or images, you're going to include things that are iconic. So this is the manuscript of Pearse's O'Donovan Rossa oration. It seems unlikely that we'd ever do an exhibition about the life of Patrick Pearse without including this star object from our collection. But should also include things that surprise. This is an object from that exhibition I was talking about earlier, Object Lessons. This is Michael Mallon's medal from the Punjab frontier. Michael Mallon is mostly famous now because he died in the 1916 Rising. And it was really interesting when this went on display in Kilmainham Jail, because the last thing you expect to see in Kilmainham Jail, Republican shrine to Irish independence, is an image of Queen Victoria. But it's a really interesting object because it really complicates that story a little bit and adds a whole new layer and a whole new dimension. And then finally, objects, but this could apply to images or stories, well, images or buildings. The main thing, as I said, as I started off with, is to tell a story. These are shells which belong to Barbara MacDonagh, who was Thomas MacDonagh's daughter. In 1917, the year after her father had been executed in Kilmainham Jail, she was on holidays with her mother and her mother's sisters in Skerries. Her mother was playing with her on the beach with some shells, and then her mother decided to go and have a swim. She swam out too far, got into difficulties, and drowned. And Barbara and these shells were taken up and brought away. And then Barbara MacDonagh kept these shells with her for the rest of her life. So these are on display in Kilmainham Jail, where you have all, I suppose, these large historic themes and big historic stories, often very macho, involving guns and destruction and big political stories. But the 1916 Rising is also a little girl who within 2 years becomes an orphan. So, as I said, always be looking for that story, that thing that will really grab people's imagination. Okay, thank you.